What's up, everybody? Peter X Coffer here, doing my second episode of the Classic Rock podcast. And so today, the 10 things that led to the decline of classic rock. Um, and I think in my first episode, The Soul of the Guitar, I kind of defined what I called classic rock. And what happened, in general with classic rock and its sound, it was a nice balance, from the mid 60s until, the mid 80s when classic rock started petering or dying out. It was a good balance there between the roots of rock and roll and which was rockabilly and blues. And I said the mid 80s, but I do count, for me, officially, the last classic rock band was, Guns N' Roses. So, going into the early 90s with Guns N' Roses. And, Guns N' Roses held its own, against the upstarts of the new rock scene, Nirvana and, Metallica. But to me, the first problems for classic rock and the lessening of the blues in this genre came in the late 70s with the rise of punk music. And I have a whole episode on punk. And punk as a thing rose in the late 70s in England, but you can trace punk back to the late 60s, the Detroit scene, MC5, late, the late Stooges. They started off kind of Beatlesque and then got more punk as they went along there in the late 60s. And when I did my trios with the Stones and the Beatles and the Who, I said that the Beatles were clearly very blues based, and the Stones and the Who leaned more into rockabilly, but the Beatles and the Who still had a lot of blues in them. And some people call the Who the first punk band, and I'm not arguing with that. But there was still a lot of the blues in both the Who and the Beatles. But I said it in the punk episode that punk is essentially white blues, and so eventually, when you have your own answer, you're going to lean into that, and I think over time, that's what happened. Punk had a critique, called. The rock stars of the era, self-absorbed and pretentious, probably a shot at Led Zeppelin, by the late 70s, a Zeppelin fan. But, when you look at the history of Zeppelin and where they were at in 77 and 78, they weren't, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant were butting heads. They were not getting along with, showed up on stage and whatnot. And then, the punk folks weren't real happy with just what they called noodling and, souling for the sake of souling. They wanted to get back to the basics, strip it down, go back to the garage rock of the mid 60s. Yeah, so that's what happened. And got a lot of respect and love punk, but look, again, I've called it, um, the white blues, and interesting when you look at the roots of punk and the roots of hip hop, they're very similar. They're very, very stripped down and basic stuff. Hip hop, started off with turntables and a couple, uh, discarded drum machines that nobody knew how to use at the time, the Roland TR-808, and the Roland SH-101 and other cheap synthesizers. And, punk started off with, off-brand cheap, guitars, cheap drum sets, and cheap basses. So they come out of the same, uh, kind of ethos in some way. So, so that's number one, the rise of punk music. Number two, and I'm going to, hey, uh, you gotta just lean into it and be real sometimes. So yeah, I'm getting in the race, whether you like it or not. So MTV's refusal to play black artists in the early '80s. I mean, every single of artist, rock artists from the '60s cites, the blues and black old R&B artists. I call it the old R&B. The Jackie Wilsons and the Sam Cooks, the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, David Bowie. I mean, they all, you know, the Brits particularly, talk about the influence of black music. But you can hear it in, Aerosmith, is upfront about it. I mean, even Ted Nugent is when it, when it when it gets down to brass tacks, he's on it, on video and record talking about the importance of the blues. Um, and it was kind of it's complicated, but it was this was a genre that was uh, uh, taken, from black music, and black folks were excluded from playing in this genre. I mean, it was very hard. I mean, you had Phil Lynott with Thin Lizzy, and you had Jimi Hendrix. But now let me be perfectly clear here. This is not on. This was the record company's fault here. They thought it was, they used the same logic, that MTV, when they were said, why don't you play black artists? Well, we're playing the artists that our audience wants to hear. And that was the record company's, stance to the entire 1970s. And while all this was happening, the Rolling Stones and Eric Clapton, everybody else is saying, hey, I grew up listening, I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for black artists. And Clapton and the Stones, took a lot of the blues artists on tour with them when they toured Europe. They didn't take them here in the US because, you know, um, the white, classic rock fans of the 1970s didn't care about the blues, but the white European artists love the blues. So, go figure. But, so yeah, number two, MTV's refusal to play black artists. I mean, you got to deal with that. And particularly now when you look at, Gen Z, and 50% of Gen Z is people of color or mixed race. I mean, the history is there. Everybody knows it, and three, related, ripping off blues artists and other black artists and not paying them. I mean, Pat Boone was notorious. Um, Led Zeppelin, they ended up settling with folks. Love Led Zeppelin, and but those love the first two albums, but you know, some of the lack of credit given to folks on those two albums for Led Zeppelin. Again, my two favorite Led Zeppelin albums, but come on, you forgot. You forgot where. Oh, I forgot that. I used this song to make this song. Come on. Issue number four. I alluded to this again, sort of foreshadowed this, the lack of black classic rock artists. Again, we got to put that on the record companies. And, I've been, reading up on different artists and the history of music. And, there were some very, very just straight up, um, flagrantly racist, folks running these record companies back, in the 70s in the heyday of classic rock. You know, can't blame, the artist didn't control that. And I think I've alluded to this in the rise and fall of rock and roll episode I did a few months ago, but it's very interesting that, none of these artists, classic rock artists owned, other than the Beatles, and I'm not sure if Led Zeppelin owned their label, but none of them own their label. And it's very interesting now that you have a lot of these hip hop artists owning their own labels, and they had to because when hip hop arose in the early '80s, the major labels wouldn't sign them. And yeah, so but again, more so on the labels, but it's also on um, the consuming public of classic rock. They weren't exactly clamoring. I mean, they were fine with Hendrix, but nobody was saying, "Hey, where are our black classic rock artists now?" I mean, I'm sure there's gonna be some white baby boomers not happy with the fact I'm focusing on race so much here. But look, I mean, millennials and Gen Z have a very different view on race than older white Americans, and this is definitely a factor. And so name names and throw down the facts, and that's what I'm doing. Um, Issue 5 that led to the decline of classic rock, hair metal. I mean, the rise and fall of rock and roll episode I did a few months ago. I mean, like hair metal songs, and nobody throws hair metal in with classic rock, but as the classic rockers aged in the early '80s, hair metal came on the scene and a little cartoonish, basic, lyrics and in songwriting. I mean, it was almost pop metal in many ways. Again, I like some of these songs and you know, tolerate some of the artists. I'm not mad at them. They made a lot of money, but it didn't help, you know, and the blues was not there in hair metal. I don't, I'm not, you know, pop metal. I'm not even sure. There was still some blues there in arena rock. I mean, Don't Stop Believing. I mean, Journey, um, uh, Cold as Ice, Foreigner, Hot Blooded, Double Vision. I mean, there's blues there. Um, Riding the Storm Out, REO Speedwagon, for, these arena rock folks I'm rolling off. I mean, there's still blues there. There wasn't a whole lot of blues when we got to hair metal. And that's really the decline. And as I said earlier, the beauty of classic rock is, uh, you know, kind of that melding of the rockabilly and the blues influence. Issue 6 on the downfall of classic rock. Um, the rise of what I will call speed metal. I mean, I've heard it called new metal, and there's lots of different subgenres of this, but I call it speed metal because that is, as rock progresses in, starting in the mid '80s and certainly through the '90s, louder and faster speed metal. So yeah, naming names. Love Metallica. I did understand, man. And Metallica wasn't the first, but they were the first big one, out of speed metal. And with the rise of speed metal and Metallica, less blues, you know, um, certainly more of the classical music. Even when I did Iron Man by Black Sabbath, I talk about even Black Sabbath had the classical music elements in there with the blues. But and the speed portion of the speed metal that's coming out of punk. So yeah, I love Metallica, but hey, I guess natural progression, you want it louder and faster. So that's issue 6. And then, issue 7, we start getting into the rise of hip hop. And I put 7 and 8 together because they're kind of specific, inflection points in albums. But number 7, NWA, Straight Out of Compton. Um, this is kind of when hip hop became more dangerous than classic rock. You remember, the Beatles and their long hair and AC/DC, who, by the way, has a lot of blues. I mean, basically the Boogie Woogie Blues. That's, Jelly Roll Morton and those folks. I mean, the piano blues players. I mean, when we think blues, we think, guitar, but there is the whole piano blues movement and the boogie woogie coming with that piano. And that's where, AC/DC takes a lot of their inspiration from. So NWA, Straight Out of Compton, but AC/DC were probably the baddest boys of classic rock. And, they're, I mean, these dudes in NWA, they were former and maybe still gang members when they put the album out, and so probably, some of them probably sold drugs. I mean, let's just be real. So, they're not talking about uh and acting dangerous. There was a real hint of danger there. And and uh, Punk Rock MBA on his YouTube channel. He talks about, hip hop was, not only was it dangerous, but it was cool. And he talks about the East Coast West Coast feud, where, I mean, you don't get more dangerous than death. I mean, Tupac Shakur and Notorious B.I.G. Biggie Smalls, over arguments and beefs, lost their life. I mean, that's more dangerous than the Rolling Stones. So, and the rise of hip hop kind of, I think, and at number 8, in Dr. Dre's, The Chronic, kind of culminates there. That's kind of when, you know, Dr. Dre's The Chronic, that kind of, to me, is sort of like, that's when hip hop was like, okay, we're not experimenting anymore. We know what we're doing. Let's move forward. We're cool in our, we're comfortable in our own skin. And so funk, this would be with James Brown with, uh, Super Bad, and with the Beatles, somewhere between Help, when they perfect the album, it's probably Sergeant Pepper, because I mean, that's when everyone's like, whoa, this is a masterpiece. That's when everybody, the peers or minds, of the Beatles, when that album dropped, and everybody's like, okay, this album is special. And, you know, rock and roll ain't going anywhere. I mean, coming out of the '60s, finally, you talk to the Who and, the Stones in the early '70s, and like, oh yeah, we didn't think we thought this would last a few years, and, then we'd have to find something else to do. But, at some point there, that, they realize, and probably with the rise of Zeppelin too. I mean, that's, that classic rock was an institution and it wasn't going anywhere. Well, Dr. Dre's Chronic was kind of that moment for hip hop. At number 9, everybody's problem child and whipping boy when it comes to the downfall of classic rock, Nirvana and grunge. It's real. It's there. Um, the combination of grunge and hair metal really, slammed the door. Because grunge was the opposite of hair metal. And, I talk about in the episode I did a few months ago, the rise and fall of rock and roll, and how grunge artists sort of critiqued um, classic rock. You know, gender and sexuality and patriarchy. In classic rock, and did a very different thing. Grunge is also a lot more political than classic rock, but it's also the sexuality and the fun and playfulness that classic rock had is gone in grunge as well. So yeah, number 9, Nirvana and Grunge. And number 10, I talk about this a lot, in the socio-political climate of, why classic rock hit so well. Because, I argue it wasn't all that really rebellious, and that's probably why punk, because it was kind of full rebellious, because they weren't, rebels challenged the system, and, other than Street Fighting Man, the Stones, love the Stones, they weren't challenging the system. Uh, the Beatles said, you say you want a revolution, and then said, yeah, nah, I'll pass. So, Led Zeppelin, they weren't, hitting the politics very hard. So, yeah, were they really rebels? And I think it was more of a dialogue between the East and West and the Cold War, because, just like hip hop can be very extravagant, with bling and cars, classic rock had that element too. But it was a dialogue with, the East and the Russian bloc, rather than, very different, you know, the commercialism and stuff in classic rock is very different than the commercialism in hip hop, because, it's very hip hop is very me centric and me focused, when it comes to the bling. So yeah, so this episode is sort of in conjunction with my episode a few months ago, the rise and fall of rock and roll. So post Guns N' Roses, there's still a lot of good rock and roll. You had Nine Inch Nails, you had Tool, you had Linkin Park. But one of the things that really, really, and I touched on this in the inaugural episode of this sub channel, The Soul of the Guitar, was right now I bounce around when it comes to uh, my music choice on my cable. So right now I'm doing Y2K, which is the early 2000s, and a lot of pretty average, mediocre rock and roll being done in the early 2000s, and that going back to the soul of the guitar is there's a lot of very mediocre um, rhythm guitar being played in these songs, and uh, and as rock progressed through the '90s and then into the 2000s, that was a real problem. I talk about how important tone is in rhythm guitar and and the hook of the song, and bringing you in and making you fall in love with the song. If you're a football fan, um, everybody talks about the most important player on the team is the quarterback. Yes, but the you can have the best quarterback in the world, but if the offensive line is not very good, your quarterback won't be very good. Look at Archie Manning in the 70s and early 80s for the New Orleans Saints. His best team was 7-9. Never went to Pro Bowls, not in the Hall of Fame, the Pro Football Hall of Fame, but Peyton and Peyton obviously will, and uh, Eli better being, better get in the Hall of Fame. But, Archie had the skills. He just didn't have the, the people around him. And when it comes to classic rock, rhythm guitar is kind of the offensive line. I mean, it's back there, lurking and setting the tone and setting the mood of these songs. But it's really, what I mean. Everybody talks about Eddie Van Halen, Jimi Hendrix, and Jimmy Page, and Eric Clapton, and these great lead guitarists. But the foundation of classic rock is the rhythm guitar, and that left that they had. Hair metal was pretty decent. Grunge, they had great, rhythm guitar there, because they were, grunge was the marriage of classic rock and punk. And so, two very different, approaches to rhythm guitar, tone and mood when it comes to, classic rock, and, a little intricate playing, when it came to the punk scene. But after, grunge goes, I mean, there's still good, Rage Against the Machine. I mean, there's still good, rock post grunge, but, the that secret sauce of the rhythm guitar, and the blues aspect of that rhythm guitar, leaves. So why do I love classic rock, and why do I miss it so much? And this is the blues side of classic rock, and this is really what's missing. But when you look at it, punk and hip hop, I mean, you, what are the adjectives you think of? High energy, boisterous. Often they can be angry. And classic rock can be that. But classic rock, I mean, you have Going to California by Led Zeppelin, you have Changes by Black Sabbath, you have Something by the Beatles. I mean, the beauty of classic rock, and it's really what is missing in a lot of music right now. Classic rock was, the strength was, all aspects of human emotion came through in classic rock. And now, you have to go to different genres to find that. Pop in some ways can, hit on all of them, but not as good as classic rock. I mean, it's, you're still, searching for the hook with pop. And, with classic rock, I mean, sometimes it's all about the mood. If the hook was there, fine. If the hook wasn't there, fine as well. So that's the strength of classic rock, and that's one reason why I believe classic rock some form will come back at some point, because these love these other art forms. Fan of punk, love my Dead Kennedys. I mean, was there for the birth of hip hop and lived through all of it and love hip hop. But there's, an R&B is, to an extent, is, can run the gamut of emotion, like classic rock, but nobody quite can do it and hit every single, emotion, and do it well like classic. I mean, Prince was the best out of R&B, but Prince is you can't really categorize. Prince is so good, you can't really categorize it. I mean, yes, he's R&B, yes, he's funk, but there's a lot of classic rock and Prince's music, and how he structured his music, and the goals that he tried to, when he wrote his greatest songs. A lot of that was through the prism of and making that emotional connection. That's what, classic rock was really good at. The love songs, R&B uh, classic rock had, they have that, the power ballad in the 80s. Hair metalish, yes, but, still there for classic rock. I mean, Layla, come on. Something. by the Beatles again. I mean, so yeah, that's kind of that's what's and the ability to hit all these emotions that I allude to. That's rooted in the blues. And that's the blues aspect that has slowly kind of seeped out of classic rock and roll in general. And at some point, will be brought back. So, yeah, thanks for coming through. Appreciate you, supporting the channel, enjoying this journey. When I started a little over a year ago on the channel, that didn't think I would be branching off and doing a classic rock channel. But as I said, hey, I'm a child of the 70s, love my funk, love my classic rock. Yep, love my disco. And yeah, disco's back. And just like disco's back, Dua Lipa, classic rock will come back in a new form. And actually, I believe my next, um, uh, episode for this sub channel will focus on how can classic rock come back and how will it come back. So thanks again. Got 5 albums of my own. Do all kinds of stuff with my music, bringing the funk, doing some hip hop, but a lot of it is through the prism of classic rock. I mean, when I think you're imprinted when you're in middle school. And that's when you start moving out of the teeny bopper phase and like really, really focusing on music. And so I came of age in the late 70s, early 80s with Pink Floyd, The Wall, AC/DC, Highway to Hell. That's the album that broke them, in the US. And so all those earlier great albums, yeah, I mean, I think those have gone gold and platinum, eventually. But when Highway to Hell dropped, those were in the import section of the record store. So yeah, so I mean, classic rock definitely informs, the structure of my music and the goals and everything else. Even though it may not sound like it all the time. So, yeah, 5 albums again, on all the streaming services. You can get to all 5 right here on my YouTube channel. Um, took a little, divergence from music for a while and did some fiction writing, science fiction, fantasy. Got 2 books in Amazon and a novella. And, about to drop some singles, getting singles focused here, through the end of this year and into early 2024. So thanks again for coming through, and I will see you next episode.